The pond was still. It lay silver and flat beneath the October sky, catching the last thin light, the way a coin catches sun at the bottom of a well. The cottonwoods along the eastern edge had gone to yellow. The cattails stood brown and dry at the shallows. Somewhere behind her, across the cut stubble field, the lanterns of Harwick were blinking on one by one as the supper crowd made its way home. Full bellies, warm coats, the easy laughter of people who had eaten well and knew they would eat well again come spring. She had slipped away before the speeches were finished. She was 40 years old. She had heard enough speeches. The cedar post stood where she had driven it 14 years ago, listing just slightly to the east now, the wood gone the color of old pewter. She touched it with 2 fingers the way you touch something you expect to find, changed and don't. The letters were still there, faded to gray, the paint cracked along the grain, but readable if you knew to look. Havermill Pond, fresh fish, fair price. She had painted those words herself with a leftover brush and a tin of barn red paint on an April evening when her hands smelled like river mud and her back ached from hauling water. Behind her, she could just hear someone calling the supper the Havermill Harvest now, as though it had always been called that. She did not mind. She understood how memory worked, how a valley full of people could laugh at a thing for 2 full seasons, and then, once the thing had proved itself, slowly forget they had ever laughed at all. She had not forgotten. She pressed her palm flat against the post and let the roughness of the wood speak to her, and the years fell away the way dry soil falls from a lifted root, all at once, and leaving something living underneath. Spring of 1887 had come in like a disappointment. The land that year was the color of old rope. The Republican River ran low and clouded, barely moving at the bends, and the grass on her 160 acres had come up thin and yellow as straw. She had been on the claim 3 years by then, 3 years of breaking sod, hauling water, mending fence line in winds that wanted to disassemble everything she built. Her larder held cornmeal, dried salt pork going rancid at the edges, 2 jars of plum preserve she had been rationing since Christmas, and the kind of stubbornness that does not photograph well but keeps a person upright. The pond sat in its hollow at the northeast corner of the claim, full enough from the spring seep, its clay bottom holding water the way good clay does, faithfully, without dramatics. She had looked at that pond every morning for 3 years and seen a problem with no solution. That April, the solution came to her on the back of a government mule wagon, sealed inside 6 wooden barrels packed with wet river moss. The wagon came up the south track just past mid-morning, the mule leaning into the collar like it had been leaning into things its whole life and had made a kind of peace with that. 2 men on the bench, one driving, one holding a clipboard, and squinting at the claim as if trying to reconcile it with something written there. She was at the fence line when they pulled up, tamping a loose post back into dry ground. She watched them come without hurrying toward them. The man with the clipboard climbed down first. He introduced himself as the superintendent of the fish culture station up north, gave the station's government name, which was long, and said it again when she did not respond with immediate recognition. He had the careful manner of a man who spent most of his working life being told no and had learned to soften the approach. He told her what was in the barrels. 2,000 fingerlings, channel catfish and bluegill both, the runted class from this season's hatch, slow growing and small, the ones that had not responded to the culture pond the way the others had. He had already driven the wagon to 4 other claims that week. 4 times he had lifted the lid of a barrel and shown the fish to a homesteader, and 4 times the homesteader had looked at those pale, sluggish shapes drifting in their dark water and said some version of the same thing, "Not worth my time." He was not a dishonest man. He said that plainly. She followed him to the back of the wagon. He pried the lid from the nearest barrel with a short crowbar, and the smell of river moss and cold water came up into the dry, April air. She looked in. They were small, smaller than she expected, given that the word fingerling already promised smallness. Some drifted near the surface with a listing quality that was not quite right. A few were paler than the others, the color of creek clay after rain. They moved in short pulses rather than the long fluid motion of a healthy fish, as if each stroke cost something. She stood there a long moment. The superintendent said nothing. He had said his piece. He understood that the pause was not confusion, but consideration, and he had the good sense to let it run its course. She was thinking about the pond, not about the fish particularly, not yet. She was thinking about the clay-bottomed hollow sitting there on the northeast corner of her claim, full of spring seep water that went nowhere, fed nothing, grew nothing but a little algae, and the occasional argument with her own helplessness. She was thinking that the pond was hers, that the land was hers, that nothing on these 160 acres had yielded anything to her without being pushed, coaxed, or stubbornly outlasted. She reached in and let the water run over her fingers. Cold, clear enough. She said yes. The superintendent wrote something on his clipboard. The mule stood without moving, the way mules do when they sense the work is almost done. The superintendent's wagon raised a thin trail of dust going north, and she stood in her yard, watching it shrink until it was nothing but a pale smear against the sky. 6 barrels, 2,000 fish. The words sat in her chest like a stone she'd chosen to carry. She moved the barrels herself, one at a time, rolling them on their edges along the rutted path that ran northeast through the knee-high grass. The clay hollow was a 1/4 mile from the cabin, just far enough that a person could forget it existed if they wanted to. She had not let herself forget it, not once in 2 years, even when it seemed like pure stubbornness to keep calling a seep-fed mudhole a resource. She heard the Greer fence before she saw them, a creak of wood, a low voice, then a second one, higher and carrying the particular pitch of a person about to enjoy themselves. She did not look up. She pried the first barrel open with the flat end of her hatchet. The smell hit her. River moss, cold water, something faintly green. She tilted the barrel slowly, letting the water find its own angle, and poured. The fingerlings entered the pond in a sliding rush, and then they were gone, not dead, not fleeing, just gone, absorbed into the murk the way rain absorbed into dust, instantly and completely. The pond looked identical to the moment before she'd poured, same flat gray-brown surface, same slow ring of sedge at the edge, same absolute silence underneath. She poured the second barrel, the same, the third. From the fence line, one of the Greer boys, she could not tell which one without looking, and she did not look, said something she could not quite hear. The woman laughed first, then the man. The laughter was not cruel exactly. It was the laughter of people who had seen a fool's bet played out and felt the comfortable relief of not being the one holding the cards. "Mud puddle," one of them said, loud enough now to carry. A mud puddle and a prayer. She poured the fourth barrel. 2,000 fish, the man said. Right there in God's murk, never to be seen again. She poured the fifth. The sixth she poured slower, watching the surface for any sign. A ripple, a flash of pale color catching the spring light. There was nothing. The pond accepted everything and showed her nothing in return, the way the prairie itself had always done, taking what she gave and offering no indication of whether it planned to give anything back. She set the last barrel on its side in the grass. The Greers were still laughing, softly now, more to each other than to her. She heard the fence creak again as they pushed off and walked back toward their own land. She stayed. The pond was still. The sky above it was the color of old tin. Somewhere in that murky half-acre, 2,000 small lives were doing the only thing they knew how to do, moving forward in the dark. The spring she'd counted on turned short. May came and went like a rumor. By the first week of June, the grass along the pond's edge had gone the color of old straw, and the sky each morning wore that particular shade of white that Nebraska settlers learned to fear. Not clouds, not clear, just heat suspended, waiting to descend. She woke before light and walked the pond's perimeter the way a doctor walks a ward, looking for signs she didn't yet know how to read. She found them soon enough. The fingerlings, which had been invisible for weeks, began appearing at the shallows in the early afternoon, not rising to feed, not moving with the quick, nervous purpose of healthy young fish. They lay near the surface in loose, scattered clusters, their small mouths working at the air above the waterline. She crouched at the pond's edge and pressed her palm flat against the surface. The water was warm as soup. She pushed her arm in to the elbow. Cooler there, but not cool enough. She pushed into the shoulder, lying on her belly in the clay mud, and felt the temperature drop another degree or two closer to the bottom. Not much. Not nearly enough against what was coming. She stood and looked at the pond for a long time. The sun had no mercy in it, no opinion about what she'd staked on this water. It simply pressed down the way it always had, indifferent to the investment, indifferent to the hours she'd already spent grinding corn and wheat into coarse meal and dropping it in careful portions from the feeding frames. It didn't care about any of that. It was just heat, doing what heat does. She walked to the house and did not stop walking until she reached the creek bottom where the willows grew thickest, the long-limbed ones with branches that bent and wept toward the water as if they were sorry for something. She stood there and thought about temperature, about shade, about the way the willows themselves survived the summer, not by fighting the heat, but by casting a narrow shadow over their own roots. She began cutting branches, not armfuls. She was deliberate, taking the longest and most supple, the ones with enough leaf mass to block light without breaking under their own weight in a wind. She carried them back in bundles across her shoulder, 3 trips, 4 her boots, leaving a worn trail through the dry grass between the creek and the pond's northeast edge, where the spring seep kept the ground slightly darker than the rest. She had no posts to spare. She had scrap lumber from the feeding frames and some old fence wire and the willows themselves, and she stood at the shallows where the fish were suffering, and she began to build a roof over the water. Not beautiful, not level. But when she'd lashed the first screen of branches between 2 leaning posts and cast its shadow across 10 feet of pond surface, she leaned out over the edge and looked down. Deeper in the shade, something small moved. Something moved. She straightened up slowly, the way a person does when they are afraid that moving too fast will end a good thing. Her knees were wet from the bank clay. Her arms ached from the lashing, but she stayed bent over the water another full minute, watching the shade lie flat on the surface like a second skin, and somewhere beneath it, in the cooler dark, A fingerling finned itself sideways and held. She went to bed that night without eating much. The next dawn she was back at the willows, before the sky had made up its mind about being light. She moved the same way she had the day before, deliberate, no wasted steps, taking the longest switches, leaving the young ones, choosing branches with leaf mass thick enough to matter. The creek bank was starting to look sparse where she'd worked nearest the water, so she walked 20 yards upstream, to a bend where the growth was heavier and the roots had drunk well. She cut there instead, 3 trips with bundles across her shoulder. 4. Her boots had worn the grass down to dust along the path now, a thin, pale track that would be visible from a distance if anyone had been watching from the west. No one was. The shade screens went up in sections. Each one was its own argument with physics. She had to lean the support posts at angles into the clay and brace them with river stones and coils of old fence wire wrapped tight at the base, then lash the willow lengths across the top with cord until the screen held its shape without swaying too badly in the afternoon push of wind. The first one she'd built had listed south overnight and lost half its shadow. She fixed the angle, added a third leg from a scrap fence rail, and moved on. By the second dawn, she had 4 screens staked along the south end. By the third, she had 7. She could not measure the temperature of the water with any instrument she owned. She measured it with her wrist, plunged into the elbow each morning, comparing it to the morning before, the way a mother reads a fever. On the morning of the 4th day, she thought it was cooler. She was not entirely sure, but the fish told her more than her skin could. They had pulled back from the shallowest edge. The corner where she'd found them, tilted and listing, where the mud had nearly baked in the afternoon sun, was empty now. Not empty the way a dying pond goes empty. Empty the way a room goes quiet when the people in it stop being afraid. She walked the full perimeter, slowly watching the water. Deeper in, where the shade stacked on top of the natural chill of the spring seep, she saw movement. Plural movement. Not 1 or 2 fish testing the edges, but a slow general stir. A whole small country going about its ordinary business just below the surface. The die-off had stopped. She didn't celebrate. She went home and ground more pond flour. The feeding frames came next. She had scrap lumber from the season she tried to build a proper chicken coop and abandoned it halfway through when the boards warped in a late rain. 3 sections of wire mesh she'd saved from a broken garden fence, the kind with gaps just wide enough to let water pass but not lose meal to the deep. She cut the lumber into shallow rectangles, stretched the mesh across the bottoms, and tacked it flat, then fitted each frame with a pair of short wooden runners so it floated level. They were not pretty. They were square and rough and functional, which was all she asked of anything she built. She set them at the water on a morning when the air still carried a remnant of night cool, spacing them across the shallower feeding end, where she'd watch the fish come up at dusk. They rode the surface like 3 small rafts waiting for passengers. The pond flour went in by the handful. She'd kept grinding through the heat crisis. Dried corn and wheat scraps worked to a coarse meal between 2 flat stones. A slow job that took an hour most evenings and left her palms red and grained with dust. She'd stored it in a crock with a fitted lid, enough for weeks if she was careful. Now she measured it out each morning, not by weight, but by intuition and observation, the same way she judged everything on that claim, and spread it across the mesh in an even layer, thin enough to dissolve and drop through in stages, thick enough to hold the fish at the surface for a few minutes where she could count them. The ledger was a thing she'd carried from Illinois, mostly empty. She'd intended it for crop records and hadn't kept them well. Now she opened it to a fresh page and drew a simple grid: date, weather, watercolor, number visible at the frames, how fast they rose, how long they fed, whether they scattered or held. The first morning she counted 41 fish breaking the surface. She wrote it down. The second morning, 53. She wrote that down too, and noted the water was greenish-brown where the sun hit it, and that there had been no wind in 3 days. It was not science the way a university man might call it science. But it was a record, and a record was a form of faith, the belief that the next morning's number would matter, that the line of figures building down the page meant something was building out in the water. She did not need anyone to tell her that. She'd seen her mother keep household accounts in hard years, the careful columns of flour and salt and lamp oil, as though naming what you had was the first step to having enough of it. The fish rose to the frames each morning with increasing certainty. The water held its color. She kept counting. The ledger pages filled slowly, one line at a time, and the summer pressed on. The rain came without much warning, the way Nebraska rain often did in late summer. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the sky had been holding its breath for weeks and simply gave out. It started on a Tuesday evening and did not stop until Thursday morning. By the time the clouds finally thinned and the sun returned, pale and apologetic, she was already standing at the pond's edge in her mud-caked boots, looking at what the storm had left. The water had risen nearly 8 inches. The inlet channel, the slow spring seep that fed the hollow from the northeast, had carried a sheet of runoff with it: topsoil, loose clay, uprooted sedge grass, and silt the color of river bottom. The pond sat brown and opaque, stirred through to its foundation. All 3 feeding frames had disappeared beneath it. She did not stand there long. She went back to the barn, changed into her oldest work clothes, and returned with the shovel. The inlet channel had to be cleared first. The overflow had packed it with a ridge of mud and matted grass that was redirecting new water across the low bank instead of into the channel itself. She dug for 3 hours that first morning, pulling the blockage free in heavy, reluctant slabs, recutting the lip of the channel so the flow ran true again. Her arms ached by midday. She kept digging. The channel was the pond's throat, and she would not leave it stopped. The frames were the second problem. She waded in without hesitation, the water rising to her thighs, and then her waist, cold even in August from the rain, the mud sucking at her boots with every step. She worked by feel as much as sight, running her hands along the submerged stakes until she found the wire mesh buried in silt. She restaked each frame by hand, pressing the sharpened posts back into the clay bottom, leveling the mesh by touch, testing each one until it held firm. It took most of the afternoon. She did not see a single fish rise that first day. The water was too thick and brown. She told herself that was not the same as them being gone. The second day, she cleared the overflow berm along the south bank, cutting a small notch to let the excess water bleed off, slowly, rather than sitting stagnant over the frame area. Her clothes dried on her body and were soaked again by mid-morning. By afternoon, her hands were blistered through her gloves. That evening, she stood at the frame edge and watched. The water was still murky, but she thought, she was almost certain, she could see something moving beneath the surface near the mesh. A slow turning, like a shadow shifting. She didn't count. She didn't write it down yet. She just watched until the light was gone. 4 months of work had gone into this pond. 2 days of hard labor had defended it. She pulled her boots from the mud with a sound like a deep, patient exhale and walked back up to the house. The mud dried. The summer burned down to its last ember and went out. September came in thin and pale, the light going sideways across the grass. By 4 in the afternoon, the mornings cold enough to see breath. She kept feeding, kept watching. The water had cleared some, not clean, never clean, but clear enough that she could stand at the frame edge and see the bottom in the shallows, the mesh still holding, the pond flower settling in slow clouds before it dissolved. And then one morning in early October, she saw them. Not shadows, not the suggestion of movement she'd been talking herself into all summer. She saw them. They were circling the near feeding frame in slow, unhurried arcs, maybe a dozen visible from where she stood, their bodies long and easy in the water, moving the way things move when they belong somewhere. Channel catfish, most of them, dark along the back and pale beneath, their whiskers trailing like threads. A few bluegill hung closer to the surface, tilted slightly in the morning light, their sides catching color she hadn't expected. A deep copper and rust, almost orange. She had poured 2,000 barely living things into this water in April, 6 months ago. She stood very still. She did not count them. She did not fetch her journal. She did not think about winter feeding schedules, or the patch on the southeast bank that still needed reinforcing, or the delivery wagon she'd been pricing with the Harwick liveryman. She did not think about the Greer boy who had called the whole project a mud pie back in May, or the look on old Fenster's face when he'd watched the barrels get unloaded. She just sat down, right there at the pond's edge in the dead grass, her coat pulled around her and her boots at the water line. The morning was cold enough that the pond held a faint mist, and the fish moved through it like they were part of a different season entirely, slow and certain in their own October. She had not sat still in, she could not remember. There had always been a next thing, a task waiting at the edge of the last one. Even in sleep, she had been rehearsing problems, sorting through solutions, measuring water levels in her mind. But sitting here, watching the surface break in quiet rings, each time a fish turned near the top, she felt something she could not have named before she earned it. The pond had done what she'd asked it to do, not because it owed her anything. Land didn't work that way. She knew that. But she had given it every careful thing she had, and it had given back. The fish were real. The water was alive. Whatever came next, winter or doubt, or the long work of turning this into something the valley would actually buy, it would come from this, from a half-acre hollow in a clay-bottomed draw that everyone had told her wasn't worth her time. She stayed until the mist burned off and the light came full across the water. It was the widow to the south who came first. She had no reason to come that May could see. The woman had kept to herself through 2 seasons of neighboring. A nod across the fence line, a wave from the seat of her wagon when their paths crossed on the Harwick Road. Polite, careful. The kind of careful that had its own history behind it, May suspected, though she had never asked. A woman working land alone learned early which silences to respect. But word traveled the valley floor the way water did, finding the low places, moving without hurry. Someone had mentioned the pond to someone. A rider had stopped at the widow's gate. A name had been spoken. May was stretching a second set of willow screens when she heard wheels in the lane. The widow was perhaps 50, with a face that had seen weather and kept it. She sat on the wagon bench with her hands loose in her lap, which May had learned to read as a sign of someone who had thought hard about coming and decided not to pretend otherwise. She did not call out a greeting. She looked at the pond. May let her look. After a long moment, the woman climbed down, without being asked, walked to the edge of the bank, and stood watching the surface. The fish were moving well that morning. You could see the slow push of bodies just beneath the clarity, the occasional flash of a tail catching the pale light. "That's bluegill," the widow said. Not a question. "Bluegill and catfish," May said. "Channel cats mostly. About 2,000 came in April. Maybe half. That many made it through the summer." The widow turned that over. "That's still 1,000 fish." Give or take. Another silence. Not uncomfortable, the kind two working women could stand in without needing to fill it. "I've got wheat going soft in the back bin," the widow said finally. "Weevil got into the lower half, but the top third is clean enough to grind. I've been meaning to haul it off." May understood what was being offered. "I've been grinding corn scraps for feeding meal. Wheat would stretch it further. I could bring a bushel at a time, and I could put aside fish when the selling starts." Neither of them said agreement or trade or anything that made it formal. They just stood there watching the water, and somehow by the time the widow climbed back onto her wagon bench, something had been decided between them that both of them would keep. May watched the wagon roll south through the dry grass, smaller and smaller, until it was just a shape in the afternoon. She had come to this pond in the mornings, believing the work was hers alone to carry. That had been true enough to build on. But there was a different kind of true starting now, quieter, less expected, and it felt steadier than solitude had ever felt, even on its best days. The winter had been lean, but not killing. That was enough. By the time the red-winged blackbirds returned to the cattail edges of the pond, May had already been up 2 hours, watching the water go from black to gray to the particular silver that meant morning had decided to stay. The fish were down in the cold depth still, slow and waiting. But they were there. That was the whole miracle of it, unremarkable now only because she had repeated it to herself so many mornings that the word alive had lost its astonishment and become simply fact. April came in wet. The pond rose 4 inches from the spring seep, and the pond flower she'd stretched with the widow's clean wheat grain had held the school through the cold months better than she dared calculate. By the 3rd week, she could see them from the bank again. Catfish working the shallows at dusk, bluegill flashing below the willow screens she'd kept, staked even through the frost. She pulled the first haul on a Tuesday. Not the whole pond, just enough. She worked the handmade net in slow arcs, the way she'd taught herself. The wooden handles smooth from a full season of use, and she laid the fish into the lidded wooden tank on the wagon bed, the tank half filled with fresh pond water, cool enough to keep them lively on the road. The load was neither heavy nor light. It was exactly what she had. 8 miles to Harwick. The road was soft from the spring wet, and the mare picked her way with patience down the ruts. May sat straight on the bench and did not rehearse what she would say. She'd spent enough of the past year in her own head. Whatever happened in that mercantile, she would meet it plain. The owner came out from behind his counter when she pulled back the tank lid. He looked at the fish the way a man looks at something he had not expected to want. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her price, and she gave it, and he did not argue. He bought every fish in the tank without pausing to count twice, and when it was done, he leaned against the counter and asked when she could come again. "Twice a week," she said, "starting next Tuesday." He nodded as though it had always been the arrangement. She drove home in the long spring evening with the empty tank rattling behind her and a folded sum of money tucked into her coat pocket. And when she reached the pond, she did not go inside. She went to the cedar post she had cut and set at the water's edge in the fall. took the small sign she had lettered by lamplight weeks before and drove the first nail home. Havermill Pond, fresh fish, fair price. The mallet struck twice. The wood rang out across the quiet water. A bluegill surfaced once, then was gone. She stood there in the cooling light and let the stillness hold her. By midsummer, she had settled into the rhythm of it, the way a person settles into any work that asks everything and gives back slowly. Tuesdays and Fridays, the wagon loaded before first light, the lidded tank sloshing behind the mule, the 8 miles to Harwick laid out in pale dust and birdsong. She learned which fish the storekeeper moved fastest, catfish by a wide margin, though the bluegill sold clean by Thursday if she left enough. She learned to pack the tank with creek water drawn the evening before, so the fish arrived lively. She learned that arriving before the butcher's boy meant her fish got the front counter. The Greers to the west took longer to come around than she had expected, but they came. It started with a question asked sideways, the way people ask things they are not ready to admit they want to know. The wife stopped her on the road in early July, ostensibly to speak about a fence line. The fence came and went in 2 sentences. Then, how do you keep them from going soft in this heat? Not a greeting, not an apology for the laughing. Just the question, practical and direct, as though the months before had not happened, and they were simply 2 women talking about water and weather and fish. She answered. She described the wet moss in the tank, the early morning departure, the way cold water holds longer than you expect if you keep the lid tight. The wife listened with the careful attention of someone taking mental notes she will not admit to taking. They parted without ceremony. The following week, the Greer husband appeared at the pond's edge on a Tuesday morning while she was loading. He stood at a distance with his hat in his hands and watched without speaking until she looked up. "I heard you were selling to Harwick," he said. "I am," she said. "Do you ever sell closer to home?" She straightened and considered him for a moment, not with coldness, but with the patience of someone who has learned to let silence do its work. "I could," she said. "Bring a bucket Friday morning." He nodded and left. He came Friday with a clean wooden bucket and paid without bargaining. His wife came with him. They looked at the pond the way people look at something they had misjudged, quietly and without theater. That was how it shifted, not in a single declaration, not with anyone admitting they had been wrong. Just a bucket on a Friday morning, and a fair price exchanged, and 2 people walking back across the grass, toward their own land, with something they needed. The valley was like that. It moved slowly, and it moved without ceremony. And by late summer, the pond had stopped being a subject of conversation altogether, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. It had become ordinary. It had become useful. It had become, in the plainest sense, something the valley had come to count on. The autumn of 1901 came in quietly, the way the best ones do. No violence of wind, no early ice, just a slow thinning of the light, and the grass gone the color of old honey across the whole valley. She walked down to the pond alone, after the supper had ended, and the lanterns at the Harwick Grange Hall were being carried back inside. Someone had called it the Havermill Harvest Supper, for the 3rd year running now, and no one had argued about it, and no vote had been taken. And that was how things got named out here, by use, by repetition, by the slow agreement of people who had decided something was true. She was 40 years old. Her hands showed it, so did her boots, and the way she moved down the slope, unhurried, reading the ground the way you learn to read ground, when you have walked it 10,000 times, in every kind of weather. The pond was still. In the failing light, It was the color of hammered pewter, smooth from edge to edge. The willows along the north end gone yellow and beginning to let go. A pair of ducks moved near the far bank without urgency. Below the surface, invisible and patient as ever, the fish that this pond had grown from nothing held their places in the cold October water. She stopped at the cedar post. The sign was still there: Havermill Pond, fresh fish, fair price. She had lettered it herself with a flat brush and black paint in the spring of 1888, the morning before her first delivery, to Harwick, and she had not replaced it when the letters faded, and she had not replaced it when the post leaned, and she had not replaced it when people told her the old one looked rough. It had done its work. It was still doing it. She put her hand on the post, not to steady herself, but just to touch it. She thought about the 6 barrels on the wagon, and the wet river moss, and the way the fingerlings had looked in the morning light when she tipped them in, small and pale and unimpressive and entirely uncertain. She thought about the laughter, which had not been cruel so much as reflexive, the way people laugh at things they cannot yet imagine surviving. And then she thought about the pond in the years that followed, the slow and unremarkable accumulation of mornings spent feeding, watching, adjusting, waiting, and how patience, practiced long enough, stops feeling like patience and starts feeling like simply knowing how to live. The land had held what she gave it. It had taken the doubt and the dry summers and the late frost and the overflow and the long months of uncertainty, and it had held all of it, the way good ground holds water, the way a clay-bottomed hollow on the northeast corner of a claim will keep something alive when everything else has gone to dust. It had given it back. That was enough. That had always been enough.